Middle East Report with James Dorsey on Sabahul Muslim.
James, welcome. I trust that you're well.
Good to be with you.
So recent public opinion polls show that an overwhelming majority of Arabs oppose diplomatic relations with Israel, but not contacts with Israeli business people and tourists.
Indeed, this is, if you wish, a sensitive moment in Israeli-Arab relations, particularly because of the rise of a far-right Israeli government under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the spiraling violence on the West Bank. Recent opinion polls you had the Saudi foreign minister in Davos at the World Economic Forum last week making very clear that the kingdom would not establish relations with Israel as long as there was not a Palestinian state, or at least real progress towards a Palestinian state. But at the same time, opinion polls show that public opinion is very, in a sense, divided on Israel. In Qatar, we saw these public manifestations where Arabic fans refused to entertain or engage with Israeli fans or Israeli media who were in Qatar for the World Cup. But at the same time, what the polls show is that while 40% of the population in various Gulf states oppose diplomatic relations with Israel, 40% do not oppose having contacts with individual Israelis, business contacts or tourism contacts. And in fact, you've had an indication this week that when tourism opens to Israel, to Saudi Arabia's new futuristic Neom city, Israeli tourists will be welcome.
Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spends his first weeks in office putting out fires in Jerusalem and Amman.
Not only in Jerusalem and Amman, but also in Abu Dhabi, Ramallah, and Washington. In fact, you had this week a visit to Israel by the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and you have early next week Anthony Blinken coming to Israel and elsewhere in the region. The Americans are extremely concerned about what's happening with Netanyahu's attempts to basically gain control of the Israeli Supreme Court, undermining the principle of an independent judiciary. But what we've more broadly seen over since Netanyahu came back to office, that he's putting out fires. He's had an issue with a visit of one of his key ministers to Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. He's got the increasing violence on the West Bank. He's got anti-religious protests, mass protests by Israelis against the religious parties and how they want to essentially turn Israel into a theocracy. So what he's been doing, really, if you look at the last few weeks, is trying to put out fires that are started either by his policies, for example, on the judiciary, or by his coalition partners and the way that they envision Israel, as well as the future or lack of a future for Palestinians.
Abu Dhabi, Ramallah and Washington, Egyptian President Fattah al-Sisi is caught in a catch-22. The IMF and Saudi Arabia are making painful economic reforms a precondition for economic support, while hardline Israeli policies threaten to spark anti-government protests fueled by widespread discontent.
Well, what you're seeing is basically, at the core of this is a change in Saudi aid policy. The Saudis are saying that they no longer will unconditionally provide aid. In a sense, that's a misleading statement, because there always were conditions on Saudi aid, and those conditions primarily were support of Saudi policies. And often the instrument that was used to enforce that sort of support for Saudi policies was not only whether or not what the kingdom gave aid, but also Hajj quotas for the Hajj. that are distributed to various countries. What the Saudis are now saying is that they also want to see economic reforms in countries that they're supporting, which makes perfect sense because in countries like Egypt, like Lebanon, like Pakistan, in many ways, aid money was going into a black hole. Nothing changed. And in both Egypt and Lebanon, we're seeing the consequence of that. Those are countries with deep economic problems, if not literally on the brink of collapse. For Egypt, it's particularly important because what it means, economic reform means that it's going to have to change the role of the military, which is the biggest player in the Egyptian economy. And it also reflects the fact that the Saudis no longer are convinced of the utility of the Egyptians. So last week you had a summit of Arab leaders organized by the United Arab Emirates, at which Egyptian President al-Sisi attended. The Saudis were absent. And the other development that points in this direction is Saudi Arabia this week signed a military cooperation agreement with Chad in Africa. And that's because the Saudis no longer see Egypt and Sudan as buffers.
Finally, then, Qatar eyes investing in an English Premier League team like Tottenham Hotspur, while Saudi Arabia is trying to acquire a Formula One team, raising the question whether government should be commercial sports owners.
Indeed. So what we're seeing is, in the past we've had Manchester City owned by the UAE, PSG, Paris Saint-Germain in France owned by Qatar, but now suddenly we're seeing an explosion in interest on the part of the Gulf countries. So Qatar is looking at becoming a Premier League player. There's been speculation about Manchester City, but there's been certainly talks with Tottenham Hotspur. The Saudis are trying to acquire the F1 formula. They already created a schism in global golf with the establishment of Live Golf. They're bidding right, left, and center for hosting opportunities. So I think what we're going to be seeing is a decade in which there's a significant evolution in terms of particularly golf presence in golf investment in international sports, with all the controversies that is going to entail.
Okay, James, thank you so much for your time. As always, really appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Listeners, you can check out James's articles at www.jamesmdorsey.net.